So now we're going to bring onto the stage a panel of experts who are going to discuss these findings. And I get to have the pleasure of introducing a wonderful moderator and a very dear friend of ours and colleague over many years, Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee from the Brookings Institute. Nicol is a senior fellow in Brookings Governance Studies Department, the director of the Center for Technology Innovation, and co-editor of Tech Tank. At the Center for Technology Innovation, Dr. Turner-Lee researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the US and to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. I also happen to know that she's been traveling a great deal and is getting ready for hearings tomorrow. So we're very grateful to have her and her wonderful panel. Please join me in welcoming them all.
Fun. I gotta take off my glasses because I can't see you all. Well, hello everybody, good morning. Okay, you can do a little better than that. It is past your second cup of coffee. Good morning. Great. Well, I'm so excited to be here. It's always great to be a regular with our dear friend at FOSI. I mean, the work that Stephen does and his organization, his team, is just second to none when it comes to exemplary research on young people. And I'm excited that he asked me to actually debut a conversation with the author included of the new report that you just heard the findings on. This is a significant period of time to have this conversation. First and foremost, we know very little about AI, generative AI in particular. And most importantly, I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm sitting in the middle of a lot of Post-it notes here in Washington, D.C., because we haven't decided on what we want to do with this. And so our hope is to really take this landmark findings of the study and maybe see if we can unpack a little bit about generative AI and how it impacts young people, which I'm really excited about. Stephen is correct. I just got off a plane from Barcelona, Spain, so if I seem a little off for people who know me, I am, because I'm still experiencing some jet lag. But I know that this panel is actually going to enliven the conversation this morning, as well as myself. So first and foremost, let me introduce the people who are here on the stage, and then we're going to jump into questions as planned. And unfortunately, because this is sort of a rocket panel, we may not have time for Q&A. First and foremost, I have Mindy Brooks, who is at Google, Dr. Tovah Klein, who is at the Barnard College Center for Toddler Development, and Kara Sundby from Kantar. Let's give them all a round of applause. So, Kara, I don't want to put you on the spot, because I know you just went through all of your findings, which were very well presented, but I'm going to. Your study focuses on teens. And so before we get into the crux of this conversation, we just would like to know, did you glean any other findings of younger children? Because obviously, teens start somewhere. I know, I have a 17-year-old and 21-year-old. And so I'm curious, as you were generating this report, what insight did you have with younger people? And if not, tell us why you chose to sort of stay in the teen base.
Well, we stayed in the teen space because it is a little bit simpler for research purposes to be interviewing teens. We spoke to teens. We included teens in our survey who were 13 to 17-year-old. But of course, it allows us to infer some findings of parenting and of what's to come in the future. And we talked about how this technology is really expected to become more entrenched and embedded in people's lives going forward. So it's certainly setting a new backdrop, if you will, of digital life for children as they grow up. We do a lot of generational research at Kantar, so we look a lot, we studied a lot of boomers, Xers, millennials. Millennials we all have referred to as the iPhone generation over the years. I think one of the defining characteristics of Gen Z has been their interaction and engagement with social media. And we can now anticipate, this is a pretty grounding starting point for this next generation of Gen Alpha, of younger children, to be growing up with genAI as the technology that will form their experiences going ahead. So I think a lot of the learnings about parents, exercising caution and trying to understand this technology will only make them smarter as they raise the younger children who won't have a learning curve with it. It will just become part of their life. It will become, like you see kids with screens today, it's intuitive to them because they've grown up with them. We'll see pretty similar findings, I think, as we see some of the younger children grow up with it.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. I'm not going to tell you, you say the smartphone generation. I am a little older than what I look. I'm thinking, am I the cassette tape generation? Like, what generation are we in terms of new technology? But that's really interesting because it means that, what we're seeing today is actually going to scale down and it will scale out, which I think is also very interesting in terms of technology.
Absolutely.
Mindy, at Google, this is obviously of importance to you. The growth and presence of genAI is inevitable, right? I see it all the time integrated into products and services that I actually use. Companies like yours are leveraging the technology for a variety of purposes, right? Whether it's draft summaries, or I've seen, with regards to Barnard, a lot of different things that it's actually integrating. I'm curious, when you think about the findings of this study, how do we best ensure that we're supporting parents? Because this is interesting when I read the study. This is one of the few times that parents are actually kind of matched with their kids. It doesn't happen often, right? And so I'm curious, for companies like yours, what do the findings mean when it comes to leveraging the technology, supporting parents and teens going forward?
Such a good question, and it's actually just so critical for us in the industry to be taking this so seriously at this time. So I would say it's twofold. First of all, from our perspective, ensuring that we are building in protections from the very start that takes into consideration the developmental needs and ages and stages of minors. Not treating them all as one monolithic group. They are very uniquely different, and as such, our policies need to be supportive of their development. So that's one thing we need to do from a company perspective. The second element is really ensuring that we are providing robust educational materials, both within products, so onboarding, when a child or a teen is going to get into the product, that we have clear onboarding that provides what we actually just launched an AI literacy guide, and you can see it at our booth out there today too, to help support teens and their parents with like the top questions they'd ask us in research. Like, what is this thing? How do I use it? What are the pros and the cons of it? And making sure that we're providing those resources in timely moments, both within product as well as when parents are looking for information. So those are ways in which we can work to support, but there's so much more we can be doing.
And that's interesting as well, because it seems like we're getting ahead of, some of the distance that exists between parent and child adoption, right, with new technology. Tovah, you talk about this with toddler development in particular. You're like, I do educational work, right? Why am I sitting on this panel? Well, you're supposed to be here because most of the time, nobody like you is here to sort of validate this. When you think about that parent match in particular, what do you think in terms of, I guess, upward and downward training? We've talked about it in terms of product development, but just social behavior development.
Yeah, I think these are the questions that I wrestle with every day, and that I think everybody in this room is thinking about, which is, this goes into the home, into the schools, everywhere else, and who's the responsible person? And interestingly, in your reports, it's parents, but for some of the international countries, it's the government or companies.
Right. Yeah.
But for the US, it's parents, and I know there's people elsewhere listening. So one of the things that I found really exciting is that parents do feel ahead on this one. And that's not, I was thinking, well, when does that gap narrow? Soon, quickly. Teens learn quickly. But all the parents coming up now have this before their children are of age to use it. And the current parents feel like they're on top of it. What I think is really important about that is whenever we meet something uncertain, it destabilizes us a bit, right? I'm actually writing a new book on this, right? So I'm like, my head is in this space all the time of uncertainty. That's hard for parents, but they're feeling a little more confident. And confidence in parenting then says, I've really got to help my child with this. I need to know something about this so I can guide my child. And again, I would tie that into educators, because this is going to be a big school issue as well at every level. It's one of the most common questions I get from professionals in the field, from parents, is the whole tech and now the AI, now genAI. I think we're all swimming in the same oh, I don't know. But if parents are a little more confident, that's a good thing.
That's right.
And we have to kind of harness that, I think, with the work you do to keep parents feeling like, oh, I can stay ahead of this and I can help my child incorporate it. The other really positive thing I thought was people in the report talking about we want transparency, which is important for parents.
Well, and I want to stay on this. I did a panel for the U.S. Department of Education some time ago, and I heard this really interesting statistic that has stuck with me, which is it was related to the teacher shortage and this conversation around if we just had the ability to use more generative AI, we could actually recruit more teachers because it sort of takes them out of the traditional mode of analog teaching and it places some new tools in their toolbox for kids. I find that to be interesting because it is actually, Kara, going to you, this is like an optimistic conversation about generative AI. I haven't been in one of these in a long time, right? In terms of technology. Talk to us a little bit about like why this technology has so much more optimism than social media and other precedents where we've seen these disconnects between parents and students.
I think it's an interesting question. I think we were surprised at the level of optimism that came through a lot of the findings. It was optimism nuanced with some concerns or some risks on the horizon, but I think by and large, people see it as a tool that's going to make their lives better. It will help them analyze more efficiently. It will help them be more productive. It will help them be more creative. And I think it's, again, trying to get to that balance of making sure that it's not taking over on certain functions, that we are still building those muscles for creativity, for critical thinking. But I think the optimism is largely because people see it as a way of getting smarter, getting more efficient with everything from financial planning to meal planning and everything in between.
Right. It may also appeal to, large language models make it easier for us, right? And it's an easier entryway, I guess, in understanding the dynamics of other aspects of technology, which take a longer time to learn, right? So that's interesting. We'll come back to that perhaps, with regards to where that fits, because that was so interesting about your conversation. There was no leaning into social media or any kind of parental confusion on this. It was pretty clear.
People were still learning the technology and trying to understand how to work it or what some of the challenges were, but I think it even surprised us with when they reflected on their teens using it, they mostly thought it was a better thing. They mostly thought that, even if it's helping their teens with their homework, that could be a good thing at the end of the day. Right. And we even had some teachers on some of the focus groups that we spoke to who very much felt the same way. It's not a bad thing. It's something we need to learn how to wield the power of it in the right way. Yeah,
I'm just thinking of when I first spoke to my 70-plus mother about generative AI. She said, girl, get out of here. What is this generational AI you're talking about? She just learned how to turn her phone around to see her camera, during the pandemic with remote medicine. So that's why I'm just like, I think, it's skipping a generation, and maybe really we're more astute than our parents when it comes to this, which is why there's better adoption. I just had to bring it up. That was a conversation we just had. Mindy, I want to come back to you, though, because this should really be like singing in your ears that there's a raised awareness, particularly on this optimism of the tool that came out of the report. And it should also sort of signal companies like Google to be more responsible when you're actually developing it, because there seems to be, this match with where you want these tools to actually evolve in society.
And I think, to the question of, what do we want out of it? We want to make sure that we're being responsible and bold. And those two things have to go hand in hand in how we're thinking about that for kids and teens. And making sure that we are, with parents having a high awareness and a high optimism, that's a great thing. But we also need to make sure that we're providing those timely materials, those educational materials, and making sure we're using it for good. And listening to our users and what they're telling us they want from the technology.
Yeah, and just kind of opened it up. I'm thinking about, Tovah, with your research, particularly in early education. The report suggests some markers when it comes to scientific knowledge and inquiry and learning. Are there other things that we should implicate or take from the report that we need to do more of, right, when it comes to seeing how this technology extends outside of the...
I actually feel like I want to be the voice of caution here because
I know, right? Too much optimism. I'm like, we're watching it.
Yeah, I like that parents are feeling confident. I think that's an important piece, but they're also, my read of this and listening to you is that they're also like, what is this?
Yes.
And when it comes to teaching, when it comes to mental health, there is no question in the scientific data, humans matter. So this idea that you could possibly replace teachers always worries me. I saw it before the genAI, I see it getting stretched now. Children and teens need humans, and that is their learning arena. So on the science side, you can say, or on the human side, we have to really keep that frame of this is a piece that's in a context for learning, but it's teachers or humans or parents who are the ones that children learn from, and peers, right? So when it gets incorporated in school, like any technology, there has to be a peer-to-peer, we're learning together component. So I think there's a move in some school systems to say, oh, we can just give them an iPad, and I've spoken to a couple of teachers in New Jersey whose school systems went to that, and they said, the children just aren't learning. They're getting facts, they're getting knowledge, but to think, you need much more than that. You need conversation, you need all these deep dives. So those are the cautions. So you can be optimistic, and you can also say, whoa, where do we need to really be protecting children? And parents, in general, are their best protectors.
That's right. Others, you want to chime in on that? You know, did you see any of those similar
Oh,
findings?
absolutely. I think, you know, of the chief concerns, we saw things that we've, I think, all read about in the media, job loss, misinformation, but loss of critical thinking and creativity was a big one for parents.
Yeah.
And for teens, it was cyberbullying. It was, you know, weaponizing this tool in ways that could harm them in pretty terrible ways. So those were, I think, from our point of view, looking across this research, what jumped out to us as some of the newer findings, perhaps, but I think it goes exactly with what you're saying. How do they use it in a way that they're still able, at the end of the day, to think for themselves and create for themselves?
Yeah, go ahead, Mindy.
I think I would just add, again, coming back to, for those of us in the room that are in the industry side of things, what a responsibility we have to be building with teens and kids in mind from the very start. It's a new technology, it's moving very, very fast, but we need to be the voice in the room that is reminding us and anchoring the technology development in a way that thinks about those users and put those protections in place. And I think that's one reason why we've gone really intentionally slow on the Google side in unlocking for teens, such that we want to make sure we're having policies, we're doing research with teens, we're doing research with parents to make sure we're understanding that impact. And I really want to call all of us in the industry to really take that charge seriously, that we have a responsibility from the start to develop this technology in a responsible way.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, just to chime in, and Tovah plugged her book, so I'll do a shameless plug of mine, right? Which is coming out in February of 2024, Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Created a New Underclass. But part of this is this cultural efficacy conversation, right? And the extent to which there's one thing, which I found interesting in the report, you know, part of the optimism is perhaps we've just done a better job in the transition of technologies across generations, particularly in our modern day economy. But then the second thing could be that potentially the people that we're talking to are much more astute when it comes to the technology itself, right? We just did a recent report at Brookings on the constraints that come with language. You know, there are only 700 languages that are training the large language model compared to dialects and, you know, slang and other things that go into that. And then there's a lot of conversation around, you know, students of color and bias that actually go into that. What I found so interesting about the report, because I tend to think about work oftentimes in technology in a very US-centered way. You know, Stephen always makes us honest to think about the global implications. So what is the difference in terms of cultural efficacy? Tovah sort of mentioned it in terms of governmental institutions versus parents being the lead agents. Did you see any of that? Is there some lessons to be gleaned in terms of our cultural comparisons of adoption?
I think it is largely looking at cultural differences in parenting styles, well as cultural, differences in people's trust in institutions, trust in government. We did a report with FOSI last year on online age assurance, and actually one of the interesting findings where the US pulled apart from, it was the UK and France, was in parenting style being so hands-on. You know, we had heard the term throughout that research of helicopter parenting in the US compared to some of the other markets, and I think that shows up in the same topic in some ways. Parents are more hands-on in parenting in the US, and we see that in why they feel they are primarily responsible for these experiences versus the other markets. Japan, I think, also gave us
Right.
some shades of color commentary when we spoke to consumers in the qual, that they really just trust that their kids need to go and learn and experience and grow through that means. So with less of the hands-on approach, more hands-off. And then on the institution side, I mean, there is more trust in institutions and in governments playing a role here in Germany and Japan than we saw in the United States as well.
And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because where people feel trust in their institutions is where they're actually going to place their kids. And, you know, you overlay that difference with the United States in terms of education or wherever our kids are expressing themselves. There's not often a lot of confidence there, which I found to be interesting. And there was another nuance in the report. If you haven't read the report, please read it, about, you know, oftentimes here in the United States, kids also finding safety in some of these tools to be able to express themselves.
Right, absolutely. The mental health aspect that came out of people using these tools today for analytical purposes, for creative purposes, but a smaller but still pretty significant number starting to engage for emotional well-being, for therapeutic purposes, and more so in Japan than we see in some of the Western markets, but I think culturally as well. Culture plays in there of people feeling more comfortable to speak with a platform about some things that culturally they don't feel comfortable sharing with a human being. So certainly culture playing into some of the use cases around mental health and well-being and emotion going forward too.
That's right. Well, and Tovah, I want to come to you on the educational side, right? Because this is an area where you probably see a lot of these expressed differences, sort of what we're talking about now. I mean, how does that play out? I mean, could you live with, as the sort of person who gave a word of truth on the panel, you know, is this a compliment to American students? Is this something that we should be looking carefully around our trusted institutions? Is it a symptom of our democracy that these tools now have evolved into platforms of agency among young people? My daughter just recently did our Brookings Tech Kink podcast on social media because we were in the car and she happened to like just come out of nowhere. If you have a 17-year-old, it doesn't happen often, right? When they talk to you and they're not on their phone. And she says, you know, Mom, it just dawns on me that no one ever asked us about how we feel about social media, and it really helped me get through the pandemic and areas of loneliness and not being able to see my friends. Is this one of those cases where we're going to see this hybrid model of generative AI based on the findings and parents understanding a little bit more about this technology?
Yeah, it's a huge question,
Yeah,
right?
right. I'm going to make you answer it all, right?
Which piece do I take?
We got time.
Yeah. The importance of asking our teens and eventually younger, not young children, but children who could answer some of these questions, I think is key because this is their life. Whether we like it or not, this is their life. You know, we might all still push back a little bit or maybe not. It's key because they need that agency, and they need that agency to be able to say, I feel like when I was in college, we used Cliff Notes. And if we all admitted that, who used it, we would say, yeah, but that wasn't my whole learning. And if parents aren't at odds with them, they're better off. So they're walking alongside them on this one. Right now, maybe the parents have more confidence. I don't think that will last long, right? So they're walking alongside. But I actually think for teenagers, they're skeptics. They're great skeptics. So in a way, asking them gives you both sides of this. And for parents to be able to say to them, yeah, I'm excited about it too, here are my concerns, leads them in a conversation, and teens want to be heard, as you know. That 2 seconds that she pipes in, you better be listening.
That's right.
And they want us to hear them.
That's right.
So I think that's a really important piece of this, because we tend to be very top down. We're going to tell you whether this is good or bad, and they're saying, no, we're going to be in that conversation from the start. And that will help all the children coming up, because we'll blink and those 5-year-olds will be 10 and then 15. And so this is here to stay. We have to keep that conversation going.
Yeah, when you said Cliff Notes, I was thinking maybe that's my generation, right? Because we actually
Instead of cassette.
I know, I was like, maybe that's, I'm the
Upgrading.
Cliff Note.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a library kid, so
Yeah.
all this is so new to me. But Mindy, I want to go back to like this cultural comparison, because Google is a global company. There's a lot of people out here in the audience that are also global companies. Do these differences matter, right? Because we also have a regulatory environment that sort of dictates different rules based on where you are in the geography. And so just curious, when you think about the findings that are saying, hey, you know, places are actually using this, you know, EU and other places, how does Google like reconcile that, right, against some of the attacks on, you know, technology in general?
I mean, the understanding the cultural differences is critical in how we're building. Like,
Right.
I mean, and I think you asked the question we were chatting earlier, like, what other research would you want after this? And I mean, I would want to understand more in emerging markets, the awareness levels, because then we can better support users in actual ways throughout our products so they can use it in the best formats. So I think it's just critical, because like then we can better design, we create for everyone, and we want to make sure that we're also recognizing the different parental needs around the world too, providing tools and resources for them that meets them where they're at versus dictating one way of doing things. So I think it's really important that we're balancing all of those perspectives.
Yeah. That makes me think about as well, you know, again, going back to this conversation of who's at the table, right? When we're actually designing and developing these. You know, your sample was good, was small, right? Diversity in that sample, where did you see like some of the opportunities to actually glean some of the different diverse perspectives, whether it's, you know, having an older parent versus a parent that may be generationally close to you, being of a different cultural background, demographic background. I know we have people looking in the audience from all over the world. You know, just some of the constraints that exist that oftentimes as a researcher I can't discover when I'm doing a lot of empirical data. What's on the edge? You know, let's break it down. I got a little bit of time before Stephen kicks me off the stage. I want to go into like what's on the edge of this, because part of what I like about FOSI is the fact that these reports come out and they become talking points for us to actually have further dialogue and discussion on this. And I don't want anybody here to leave here and think, okay, I'm going to read the report and have maybe the same level of optimism you're seeing on this panel, because that's not the world in which we live, right? So what's on the edge that you wish you could have actually spoken more about, or you saw the beginnings of, and then I want to throw that to everybody else. Like, what are we not talking about that we have to be sensitive to?
I mean, I think the topic of, so diversity of consumers, whether it's international or even within the United States, looking at household incomes, looking at race and ethnicity, trying to understand, I think for the newness of the topic, we went to more of the general population view. The data's there for the other pieces, but the storyline here was really trying to understand parents against teens and then the countries against countries. But certainly trying to dig into some of the nuances around income levels, about parents with older children versus younger children was another angle that we were pretty interested to look into too. And if we could, you know, keep doing the research and keep looking into it in the years that come, I think we'll see a lot within those crevasses of consumers or of users, as well as trying to look at more fundamental things like how is the future of education going to shape up off the back of this? What are some of the bigger topics that we should be looking at as we consider the future?
Yeah, no, I like the way you're sort of posing it. Like, there's additional questions. I mean, that's the great thing about being a researcher, right? You start, and then you just keep on going deeper and deeper.
We have lots of questions, I mean, there's lots of, it's sort of like we're in on the ground floor with this first perspective. There's so many places we could still take it, and looking for nuance, looking, you know, at specific topics, and starting to dig in some more.
Tovah?
Yeah, I mean, I really think about who is this going to reach. So there's the good and the bad of it, right? So on the good side, if you want to be optimistic, which we should be, who's going to get that good optimism? And I think the pandemic just so laid that bare for us. You know, children and families sitting in parking lots in their cars so that they could get Wi-Fi. And I would be the first to say parents need to be involved with this. Well, not every parent has that luxury. You know, you're working long hours, you're working 2 jobs, or you're shuffling children to daycare and high school. So who's going to actually have access to this? And I feel like we too often give lip service to, oh, that educational gap, but that educational gap is going to keep happening. And so we have to decide, like you're talking about with product development, how are we going to really make sure that this is accessible, that children have a good human teacher, that the parents are supported, and that they have access to whatever good there is in this.
That's right.
As we think about the cautions.
Well, you just went down my alley, so I'm gonna stay there with you for a minute, right? I mean, that is such an interesting kind of conversation because contextualizing the research, as you've just mentioned, this was during the pandemic, right? And there were a lot of federal resources that came into play, which makes me think about that government question. We had the Affordable Connectivity Program that came out there and connected families. We had, the biggest broadband infrastructure investment now on the tail end of knowing that the internet was still operable and people were still able to do some of those things, even if they did it from a parking lot, which I do talk about in my book. But the question is, to me, it seems like, it is this confluence of government, parents, and institutions that what we're seeing overseas that may actually be coming into the United States a little differently than we've seen it before. And I just want to stay on you for a moment, Tovah, just on with your conversation with school. I mean, years ago, the conversation of parent engagement was very, very hard to have because parents weren't showing up because we didn't know what our children were being taught. And we came with a certain level of lack of understanding because maybe we didn't have the same degree or the same opportunity. Again, when you think about where we're seeing these narrow gaps in this report, I mean, is that optimism on that part at least, that we're making some strides in, parent-student relationships when it comes to tech?
Yeah, that was to me the exciting piece of this is like, oh my gosh, for once, like we the parents are not like in left field and the kids are like, Mom, do you know what this is? We're like, yeah, we know what this is. And as a college professor, that was my entree into this. It actually wasn't from my wonderful children, but as a college professor, right, because there was a lot of discussion all last year, and then the students that started creeping in, and I was like, what are you doing? So I think that's very optimistic.
It is interesting.
And that we have to really jump on it, as you've done in this report and shown in this report, that parents and teens, at least in this window, are side by side, and those teens often are gonna have younger siblings. So how do we keep them side by side, and how do we keep parents feeling like I'm not in left field? And there are ways that schools and parents can communicate now that have really bridged that gap as long as parents have access.
That's right.
Right? When I read about the rural communities, I come from a big city, but when I read about the rural communities, I think, they're getting lost, but also people within any of our cities are getting lost.
Yeah.
Right? So we really have to keep that, I think, forefront, not as like, oh yeah, that thing, but really this has to reach everybody.
That's right.
Or we're going to really be leaving children out in a big, big way, and you don't want that to happen.
Yeah, that's the tragedy of the digital divide. I'm testifying, as Eva said, tomorrow around leveraging AI for our modern communication system. And what dawned on me is like AI and the digital divide are not actually separate things.
Right.
You actually need full connectivity to actually involve populations in these conversations because without broadband infrastructure, they cannot be in these conversations. And you need to embolden institutions and actors of agency and importance and trusted among parents and students to make these technologies work. So your revelation as a person who sits outside of the normal, tech policy, space is really enlightening because that speaks to some of these conversations. Mindy, I just kind of bring it over to you. Like, don't you wish you had more of these moments when it came to technology design and deployment? Like, this is an opportunity for Google and other companies to sort of learn how to coalesce these opinions. Why do we miss these moments in previous iterations of technology and education?
I don't know if we always missed it. I just think that we're getting better at talking about it.
Yes.
And I think that's like we're coming together here to like face these conversations and be like, hey, how do we sharpen as an industry and as people in the room? So I think it's just like such a critical period. Right?
It is. And having these moments, just to sort of go back to the report, as we begin to wrap up, I got one more question for all of you and then we'll wrap up. Having these moments, as a company and industry that's doing this work, what does it do for you when you start to look at the next iteration of generative AI or the next iteration of the next big thing? How do these lessons sort of implore you to go into that next stage? Because these technologies, as you know, aren't they're not stagnant. They're going to grow and develop. Yeah. Next year is going to be something different, right?
Yeah, I'll maybe use a story to kind of illustrate where I think we are. A number of years ago when that thing called a touch device came out, I was in a school in the Bronx doing research at Sesame Street on this new device in a black box, testing it with 4-year-olds. a brand new app we were designing, and it was one of those moments. I walked in the room, and I didn't use a touch device at that moment, and so I'm playing around with this thing and scraping my fingernail across it and not able to move it. And this 4-year-old is swiping left, right, center. They knew how to do it. It was so intuitive, and it was one of those moments where I'm like, everything is changing at this moment. It was one of those moments I walked out, I said to my colleagues, this is the game changer. And I think we're at another period right now. It's like, what do we do in those game-changing moments? I think we come together, we set industry best practices. We rally around making sure we have policies in place that support our users in a way that's healthy and developing great practices across the industry. And I think that's really important at this moment too. What lessons did we learn there? We all coalesced around how do we develop policies in this new emerging rapid space? So I think it's such an interesting moment just to pause and be like, what is going on? What have we learned? How do we replicate? And then what do we actually need to improve and innovate on with this new technology?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we often don't hear the word pause.
Pause is
in innovation. So the fact that we heard that today, that is one for the books, right? Because, technology has operated under what Adam Thierer said years ago, permissionless innovation. And now we're at a stage where we're trying to make better sense of how it's contextualized in these verticals. I want to wrap up there's just so much fullness, and people who know me know I can talk for a really long time, so I'm not going to do that because I'm looking at this clock. I want to wrap up with, again, these policy prescriptions, because no conversation would be complete if we didn't walk away with, I think, what Mindy started, things that we need to take away from this conversation, whether it's on legislation, whether it's on self-regulation, whether it's on, getting closer to the customer when it comes to our students and parents. You mentioned a few of them in your presentation, Kara. Anything else that you want to glean from those recommendations as we wrap up?
No, I think one of the biggest thing that, if we look across the research presented today and looking into the report as well, there's so many stakeholders involved with this. And on the topic of responsibility, it's parents themselves, it's governments, it's companies, but schools also feature, teens themselves feature. We have to ask them what they're thinking. And I think with policy, this was one of the recommendations, is you need to look across this constellation of players and make sure that you're getting all of those inputs. You need to be speaking to underrepresented groups. You need to be engaging those who might be at the fringes of the conversation. And I think, as Mindy said, we're hopefully moving into a place where we're asking better questions. We've gone through tech transformations before. We also need to be better at engaging more folks in these discussions.
Tovah?
You've got me at a loss here. I think part of it, when I think about the parent-child piece across ages, across cultures, is this idea that this is one piece. So I always find in that panic before we pause that we do need to take an exhale and say, yeah, this is a shift, but that doesn't change the need for parents and children to be together, for children to play. What's the basis of critical thinking skills? It's playing, it's engaging with the environment, it's realizing you're part of a community, a family, a bigger world. So this is a piece, but it's not going to shift everything. And for us, anybody in the industry, myself, you, and I'm sure your new book addresses this, is this idea that parents are there to support children no matter what changes around them. And we know this because, whether you were raised in the Depression or during wars or during the current, it's parents who are really the influencer at the end of the day. So I think that's the piece that I'm going to walk away really thinking about. This is a cool, important shift, but it's one piece.
That's right. And parent is actually defined so differently today, too, in terms of the nuance. Who is the parent, right? Oftentimes, the parent is somebody that's not biological. In certain communities, it's a grandmother, it's a neighbor, it's someone who took the time to actually believe in a student. So these are like different things, that we should think about. Mindy, any other final things after what you mentioned in terms of that, and then I'll wrap us up?
I just think, I just really go back to making sure we're hearing the voice of the teen in this conversation, and minors, and from variety of diversity of backgrounds, making sure that we're actually investing our time and our energy to listen to them. Like, we can design for ourselves, but we all know, we're whatever, the cassette tape generation or whatever we are, that is probably not going to resonate. Cliff notes, if we're upgrading. That's probably not going to resonate with teens. So, like, how do we actually design it with them in mind from that very start? And I just think that's such an important jumping off point from this research, is making sure that we're doing that in a representative way.
So I get to, as moderator privilege, sort of think about everything that you all said and kind of wrap this up, but I want to share a story as well. So prior to the pandemic, I tell the stories in my book, but I also tell the story on my Brookings page about visiting a couple of schools that were part of the Obama administration's Connect initiative. And they had given tablets that had come through a partnership with Apple at the time to students, and they were using these tablets to do really creative stuff. And this principal in Marion, Alabama, which is a black rural school, was basically high-fiving the kids as they were walking out of the school with a tablet under their arm and a cell phone in the other. And in the school that I visited in Phoenix, which was predominantly Latina, all of the kids had cell phones, and essentially, not for reasons that we thought, they had it because of fear of a parent's deportation. So it wasn't for schoolwork. But what was interesting is, despite all that enthusiasm at the time, before the pandemic, and this technology, those schools were still poor performing schools. But there was something in that school, to your point, that stood out for me, even though they were the lowest, is this engagement of love and care that came from the parents that walked into that school, but didn't know a lot about what was on those machines, but they knew that their kids would be equally excited about it. My point is, we'll never know why parents and students are closely aligned when it comes to generative AI. And we'll really never know if parents really know what they're talking about, right, when it comes to this. But what we do know is that we've got an entryway for the first time to actually have a discussion and discourse between these two parties in a productive way that ultimately, for everybody in this room, I argue that when we close the digital divide, we're actually addressing incapacities or insufficiencies with workforce placement and educational design, and not allowing the next generation of STEM producers because they don't have the tools. So we've leveled the playing field a little bit, right? We just have to walk, I think, with some caution, and the report does that, to see what else do we need to ask as questions. So that was my long dissertation, but I have 4 minutes to spare to actually share that. First and foremost, anything else you all want to say? Keep it brief, because they're over there in the wings about to usher us off. And I know you all are tired of listening to us. But listen, thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. And on that note, please read the report. You will actually glean more of what we talked about. It's all in the report. And we thank you for, Stephen, for allowing us to indulge ourselves around this new content. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
So I'm going to